There is a photograph. You've probably never seen it, but once you do, you won't forget it. Sepia-toned, damaged at the edges, stamped with a date in the lower corner, 1901. It shows a man standing on a stage inside Barnum and Bailey's Circus. And I use the word man loosely, because what you're actually looking at doesn't fit that category comfortably. He is over 9 feet tall, maybe closer to 10. The people around him, trained circus performers, adults in their prime, barely reach his chest. He isn't standing on a platform, he isn't crouching on an elevated surface. There are no mirrors, no camera tricks, no forced perspective. He is simply standing there, upright, relaxed, looking out at the crowd like a man who has seen far too much of this world to be impressed by any of it. And in the corner of that photograph, written in faded ink, is a name, the Giant of Romania. Now here's where most people stop and say, okay, gigantism, pituitary tumor, excess growth hormone, medical condition, mystery solved, move on. But I need you to stay with me for a moment, because the medical explanation only answers the easiest question. It answers how tall he was. It says nothing at all, about what he knew, what he said, where his body went when he died, and why every single official record connected to this man seems to have simply ceased to exist. That's what this video is actually about. By 1901, the era of displaying human giants in American circuses was ending. Medical institutions were raising uncomfortable questions. Journalists were investigating. The public was growing uneasy with the exhibition of human beings as spectacle. Barnum and Bailey, reading the room, announced this would be their last season featuring what they called their true giants. Not tall men with perspective illusions. Giants. People whose height defied ordinary explanation. The Giant of Romania was the last, and by all accounts the tallest. He performed across the eastern seaboard that year: Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Baltimore. Crowds packed in to see him, expecting a sideshow trick, and left shaken because there was no trick to find. He was simply enormous, real, present. And when he opened his mouth, the show became something no circus promoter had prepared for. He spoke. Not circus patter, not rehearsed entertainment. He gave speeches, detailed, specific, geographic speeches about cities, about buildings, about technologies, in multiple languages, switching mid-sentence, as if he'd learned each one in a different country across a different century. And the audiences laughed, because what else do you do when a 10-foot man starts describing a civilization that isn't supposed to exist? But some people in those audiences didn't laugh. They went home and wrote letters to newspapers. And what they said was consistent. Something in his voice didn't sound like performance. Something in his eyes suggested he wasn't telling stories. He was reporting. In August 1901, during a performance in Philadelphia, the Giant described a city he said he had visited personally. He described massive buildings with domed roofs, streets laid out in precise geometric patterns, a central tower, tall, humming, generating power without any wires connecting it to anything. The audience laughed. The newspapers reported it as the Giant's colourful tales. But here's what the newspapers didn't know, couldn't have known, because the discovery wouldn't happen for another 50 years. In the 1950s, archaeologists excavating sites in Turkey uncovered the remains of a pre-flood settlement. The structures they found had domed roofs. The streets were laid in geometric formations, and embedded in the architecture was evidence of an electrical system that modern researchers, to this day, cannot fully explain. The Giant described it in 1901. The archaeologists found it in the 1950s. Explain that. Now let's talk about the 3 problems with the official story, because there is an official story, and it has significant cracks running through it that nobody in mainstream history seems interested in examining. Problem 1. His age. The mainstream account says the Giant of Romania was born in Transylvania sometime in the 1870s. That would make him somewhere between 25 and 35 years old in 1901. A young man. a sick young man, by the medical account, suffering from the advanced stages of gigantism. But that's not what people saw. Journalists and audience members who wrote about him consistently described features that didn't match a man in his 20s or 30s. Deep wrinkles, weathered skin, hands that looked, and this is a direct description from a 1901 Philadelphia newspaper, ancient. One journalist wrote, and I'm paraphrasing closely here, that his eyes carried a quality of someone who had witnessed far too much. That he looked like a man who had lived not one lifetime, but several. That's not how people described young men with gigantism. That's how people describe someone genuinely, profoundly, impossibly old. Problem 2. His knowledge. At a September 1901 performance in Boston, the giant stopped mid-show and began describing a construction technique. He said, "You take massive stones and you shape them so precisely, so exactly, that they lock together through weight and geometry alone. No mortar, no binding material. The shape is the structure." The audience assumed he was making it up. He was describing polygonal masonry, a construction method found in Incan ruins, in Egyptian monuments, in megalithic sites scattered across 6 continents. A technique that modern engineers can observe in ancient structures but cannot replicate with contemporary tools because we don't fully understand how it was done. How does a Romanian peasant with a pituitary tumor know about acoustic resonance engineering in Mayan temples? How does he know about irrigation systems that moved water uphill without mechanical pumps? How does he know about construction methods that mainstream archaeology classifies as ancient mysteries? The medical explanation has no answer for this. It explains his height. It says absolutely nothing about his knowledge. Problem 3. His body. This is the one that should disturb you most. The giant of Romania died in December 1901. He had been given a small pension by the Circus and a room in a Baltimore boarding house after the season ended. A cleaning woman found him 3 days after he passed. By the time neighbors understood what was happening, men were already removing the body. An unmarked wagon, no ceremony, no announcement. The boarding house owner later told investigators that representatives from a medical college had come to collect the body. That made sense. Circus giants almost always received autopsies because medical institutions wanted to study their pituitary abnormalities. Their remains were documented, catalogued, and preserved. But here's what the records show. Nothing. There is no death certificate in the Maryland State Records for December 1901. No burial record in any Baltimore cemetery. No autopsy report in any medical college archive. Not Johns Hopkins, not the University of Maryland, not any institution that existed in that city at that time. No obituary beyond the brief newspaper notices reporting his death. He died. And then every official trace of him was erased. For context, circus performers in this era, even obscure ones, even anonymous ones, left records. The infrastructure existed. Death certificates were filed. Bodies were claimed or buried in paupers' graves with documentation. The systematic absence of documentation for the giant of Romania isn't normal bureaucratic sloppiness. It's something else. In November 1901, 1 month before his death, the giant gave what would turn out to be his final recorded public speech. It was in New York. The circus was closing out its season. He stood on stage, looked out at the crowd, and said something that the newspapers reported with a mixture of confusion and mockery. He said he had lived for over 150 years. He said he had watched his entire civilization disappear beneath mud and water while he survived in the mountains. He said he had spent 50 years in this new world that rose from the floodwater, trying to tell people what had been lost, and that no one listened. He said that soon he would die, and there would be no one left who remembered the old world. That everything his people had built, every structure, every system, every piece of knowledge would exist only in ruins that the new humans would misinterpret, misdate, and misfile into a history that served their current understanding rather than the truth. Then he did something unexpected. He gave directions, specific geographical coordinates, described in terms of mountain landmarks in the Carpathian Range in Romania. He said that in those mountains were structures still standing, buildings that hadn't been buried in the flood, and he said that anyone who went there would find proof, architecture that didn't match the official historical timeline, artifacts from a civilization that existed not in ancient times, but recently, far more recently than anyone in that audience was prepared to accept. The newspapers printed this as the giant's closing performance, his grand finale of fantasy. In 1926, an archaeological team entered the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. They found structures, massive stone blocks fitted with extreme precision, architecture that matched no known style from any catalogued culture, no mortar, no binding material, construction that shouldn't have been possible for whatever population mainstream history placed in that region during that era. The team's official report classified the site as belonging to an unknown ancient culture, which is the academic way of saying we don't know what this is, and we're not prepared to say something that will end our careers. When radiocarbon dating became available in the 1950s, samples taken from the site returned dates in the early 1800s. The mainstream response was immediate: contamination. The samples were contaminated, the dates were wrong. The structures must be ancient, because nothing that's sophisticated could have been built that recently by people we have no record of. But what if the dates weren't wrong? What if the dates were exactly right? The giant wasn't alone in saying these things. This is important. He was not an isolated case. Between 1870 and 1905, there are records of at least 7 other exhibited giants who gave similar speeches. They spoke about buried cities, about timeline discrepancies, specifically that the calendar had been altered, that centuries had been artificially inserted into the historical record to create distance between the present civilization and the one that had been destroyed. They spoke about technologies that modern audiences had no framework to understand. All of them died young. All of them disappeared from official records after death. All of them were dismissed, in their lifetimes and afterward, as either medical curiosities performing for crowds or outright frauds. And the photographs of all of them show the same thing the giant of Romania's photographs show: people who are genuinely, proportionally, enormously tall. Not the distorted proportions you see in modern cases of medical gigantism, extended limbs, enlarged joints, visible physiological strain. These figures look like scaled-up humans, as if they came from a population where 9 or 10 feet was not an anomaly, where it was simply where some people fell on the bell curve of normal variation. In his final month, accounts from people who spent time with the giant outside of performances describe someone who had stopped performing entirely, who sat quietly, who occasionally spoke in languages no one around him recognized, who sometimes looked out windows for long stretches without saying anything. One account from a circus worker who knew him describes asking the giant if he was afraid of dying. The giant apparently thought about this for a long moment, then said, and this was translated through an interpreter, that dying wasn't what troubled him. What troubled him was what died with him, that there would be no record, that the new world had no patience for what the old world had been. That mud covers everything eventually, and humans are very good at deciding the mud was always there. So where does this leave us? There is a photograph of a man who is impossibly tall. There are newspaper accounts of specific, verifiable knowledge that he expressed decades before mainstream science caught up to it. There is a complete absence of any physical record, body, death certificate, burial, autopsy, for a man whose death was publicly reported. There are similar accounts from at least 7 other giants in the same era, all of whom similarly vanished from records. There are structures in the Carpathian Mountains that return dates from the early 1800s and were immediately dismissed as contaminated. And there is a theory, which mainstream history does not engage with, only ignores, that a global civilization existed before the early 19th century and was destroyed in a catastrophic event that buried cities, killed most of the population, and reset human development to a lower technological baseline. The Tartaria theory doesn't require you to believe in fantasy. It requires you to look at what the evidence actually says before deciding what narrative to assign it to. The mainstream interpretation requires you to accept that a young man with a pituitary condition somehow acquired precise knowledge of acoustic engineering, polygonal masonry, pre-flood settlement layouts, and Carpathian mountain geography, and then to accept that his body, unlike every other documented circus giant in history, simply vanished without a single institutional record. The alternative interpretation requires you to accept that the official historical timeline is incomplete, that a civilization existed whose survivors occasionally appeared in 19th century circus tents, trying to tell audiences what had been erased, and that when those survivors died, someone made sure they stayed erased. Neither explanation is comfortable, both use the same evidence, and only one of them explains all of it. The giant of Romania died alone in a boarding house in Baltimore in December 1901. No funeral, no grave, no record, just a photograph, some newspaper accounts, and the words he spoke on a New York stage 1 month before the end, looking out at a crowd that thought he was performing, "Soon I will die, and there will be no one left who remembers. Everything we built will exist only in ruins that you will misread. You will give our work ancient dates to make it feel safely distant, and the mud will keep our cities, and you will never look for them in the right places." He was right about one thing, at minimum: nobody looked. The Tartaria archive exists because somebody has to. Subscribe. The evidence doesn't disappear just because the records do.